Have you ever trusted someone so much only to have them break your heart in the worst possible way? Have you ever looked into the eyes of the person you loved most and realized they were the one hurting you the most, without even a hint of regret? Let me ask you, what would you do if your own husband not only betrayed you, but made sure the whole world saw it? Would you crumble? Would you fight back? Or would you hold your head up, even when it feels impossible? This is Evelyn's story, and honestly, it could be any of us. She gave everything to her marriage, only to watch it all fall apart in one single shattering moment. And here's the real question. When life tries to destroy your spirit, how do you hold on to your dignity? Is it even possible to find yourself again after losing everything? I want you to hear this, because I promise, what happened next is proof that karma is real, and that quiet strength is more powerful than any revenge. So, stay with me. Let's go on this journey together, a journey through heartbreak, betrayal, and the kind of transformation that will make you believe and hope again. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The mornings in Thomas's apartment were colder than the weather outside, and Evelyn felt it with every breath. She sat alone at the kitchen island, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, while Thomas scrolled through his phone, barely glancing her way. She wore a soft gray robe, one he used to say made her look peaceful and warm, but now he didn't seem to notice she was even there. "Heading out early?" Evelyn asked quietly, her voice almost hesitant. Thomas didn't look up. "Work's busy," he mumbled, grabbing his keys with an impatient clatter. Evelyn watched him move, feeling like a stranger in her own home, wondering how love could disappear so silently. She pressed her palm against her chest, trying to steady the ache there, pretending not to see Thomas's phone buzzing over and over again, Megan's name flashing one too many times. Something inside her was breaking, slowly and methodically, but she wore her strongest armor. A smile. No one could see through it, she told herself. This was just a rough patch. She told herself he would come back to her. But deep down, a small voice whispered that some cracks never heal. They only grow wider. That evening, Evelyn sat curled up on the sofa, her favorite romance novel open but unread on her lap. Thomas's laughter drifted from his office down the hall, a sound she hadn't heard directed at her in months. She strained to listen, catching bits of light, teasing, flirtatious conversation, the kind of intimacy that once belonged only to them. Her heart twisted painfully. She stood up, walking quietly toward the door, but before she could knock, she froze at the sound of Thomas's voice. "Yeah, don't worry, she'll come to the reunion," he was saying. "I want everyone to see what I traded up for." Evelyn's breath caught. She backed away slowly, her vision blurring. He wasn't just ignoring her, he was planning to humiliate her. Tears burned her eyes, but she wiped them away fiercely. She would not cry for a man who couldn't see her worth. She would not break. Not yet. In that moment, standing in the dim hallway of a home that no longer felt like hers, Evelyn made a silent vow to herself. Whatever storm was coming, she would survive it. Quietly, gracefully. She would endure. And when the time came, she would rise. Megan leaned against the edge of Thomas's sleek glass desk, her red lips curved into a smirk as she scrolled through pictures on her phone. "You're seriously still letting her walk in there beside you?" She purred, tossing her shiny hair over her shoulder. Thomas glanced up, the faintest trace of irritation on his face. "She's harmless," he muttered, but Megan wasn't letting it go. She sauntered closer, settling herself on his lap like a queen claiming her throne, her voice low and silky as she whispered in his ear. "Thomas, listen to me. Everyone at the reunion will think you've downgraded if you show up with her." Her words slipped into his mind like poison. "You deserve someone dazzling, someone truly worthy of you." Her manicured fingers traced along his jawline. "Let them see who you really chose." Thomas's defenses melted under her touch. In his mind, he pictured Evelyn standing awkwardly beside Megan, dull and invisible. The idea fed his ego, wrapping around him like a warm coat. Megan watched the shift in his eyes with satisfaction. She was an expert at planting seeds of doubt and destruction, and tonight she was sowing a whole forest. The plan unfolded in whispered conversations and stolen kisses, each word another dagger pointed straight at Evelyn's heart. "Maybe we should make a bit of a show," Megan suggested lightly, tracing lazy circles on Thomas's chest. "Laugh a little louder, dance a little closer. Let her see what she lost. Thomas chuckled, a low, cruel sound that rumbled in his chest. You're wicked, he teased, pulling her closer. Megan leaned in, her voice a breathy caress meant only for him. She knew she had him wrapped around her finger. She also knew Thomas's arrogance made him blind to consequences. Their laughter filled the room, a harsh contrast to the heavy silence downstairs, where Evelyn sat, unaware that the stage was being set against her. Every time Megan whispered another idea, Thomas felt more powerful, more justified. In his mind, Evelyn was just a forgotten page in a book he'd long since closed. Megan kept feeding his fantasy until it grew monstrous, until Thomas could no longer see the woman who once waited for him in the rain, hoping he'd open the door. Now all he saw was a fleeting, cruel chance to feel superior again. Thomas waited until dinner time, choosing the moment when Evelyn's defenses would be at their lowest. She sat across the table, gently stirring her bowl of soup, her face composed in a mask of habitual politeness. He watched her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair, his tone casual. Hey, Evie, he said, forcing a touch of warmth into his voice. There's a reunion this Saturday. Thought maybe we could go together. Evelyn looked up, surprised by the unexpected invitation. A small, hopeful smile flickered on her lips before she quickly hid it. You want me to come with you? She asked carefully. Thomas just shrugged, stabbing a piece of chicken with his fork. Yeah, everyone will be there. Good food, a chance to catch up with old friends. Could be fun. He didn't look at her, keeping his focus on his plate, but in his mind he was already picturing it, her standing awkwardly beside him, while Megan lit up the room like a rose next to a wilted daisy. Evelyn, oblivious to the cruel undertones, nodded slowly. All right, she said softly. I'll come. Hope flickered in her chest, a foolish, stubborn hope she couldn't quite put out. After dinner, Evelyn found herself by the closet, running her fingers over clothes she hadn't worn in months. Maybe, she whispered to herself, maybe he's trying. She picked out a simple, pale pink dress, understated but pretty, and held it up to the mirror, imagining for a brief, fragile moment that this night could be a new beginning. Meanwhile, Thomas texted Megan from the bathroom. She's coming. Get ready to have some fun. The reply came instantly, a laughing emoji, followed by, she won't know what hit her. Thomas smirked and pocketed his phone before returning to the living room, where Evelyn sat quietly, polishing a modest pair of heels. You look beautiful, he said, tossing the words out so carelessly that they stung, even though they made her heart flutter. Evelyn looked up, blinking quickly to stop tears from falling. Thanks, Thomas, she whispered. In her mind, she painted over the cracks with bright colors, pretending that maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to be seen again. But Thomas wasn't reaching for her hand. He was giving her a loaded gun without warning her of the wound it would cause. The days leading up to the reunion were filled with preparations, but not the kind Evelyn imagined. Thomas and Megan met in secret at a cafe downtown, laughing over lattes as they mapped out every painful moment. You'll introduce me as your real partner, Megan purred, stirring her coffee with a silver spoon, and I'll make sure everyone knows Evelyn's just tagging along out of pity. Thomas leaned back, arms crossed, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. She won't even see it coming, he said smugly. Megan giggled, tapping her manicured nails on the table. Exactly, and when they see how radiant we look together? She let the thought dangle between them, a twisted little dream. Thomas nodded. It'll be a night to remember. Their laughter mixed with the clink of cups and the low hum of the other customers, a sharp, ugly note beneath the cafe's soft music. Every word they exchanged was another step in a dance of betrayal, choreographed with precision and venom. Meanwhile, Evelyn spent her evenings meticulously ironing her chosen dress, smoothing every wrinkle with trembling hands. She applied a homemade face mask, hoping the tiredness in her eyes would fade by Saturday. But no matter how many times she pressed the iron across the soft fabric, her hands wouldn't stop shaking. There were nights, that week, when she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, sleep nowhere to be found. The silence was so dense it pressed against her chest, and the smallest sound, a car passing, the house settling, the distant bark of a dog, would make her startle upright. Sometimes she would walk to the mirror at midnight, staring at her own hollow reflection, tracing the shadows under her eyes, fighting the urge to break down and cry. Maybe Thomas will see me again, she thought, pressing a hand to her chest, where hope still stubbornly bloomed. She hadn't told anyone about the reunion, wanting to believe it would be a quiet, healing night. Alone in her bedroom, she practiced small smiles and light conversation, reminding herself how to blend in without disappearing completely. There were moments when rehearsing in front of the mirror that her voice would catch. She would have to pause, take a deep breath, and remind herself she was not the broken woman she feared. She tried different outfits and, noticing the way her dress now hung a little loose at the waist, realized how much weight she'd lost over the past months. The stress had etched itself onto her body, and she wondered if anyone else would notice, or if they'd only see the awkward, nervous woman she felt she'd become. She didn't see the trap being laid for her. She didn't hear the whispers. The mocking laughter that would greet her was still hidden. All she carried was her fragile faith that somehow, she still mattered to the man she once called her world. In her innocence, she polished her shoes a second time, checking herself in the mirror. "You're enough, Evelyn," she whispered, offering herself the comfort Thomas no longer did. "You're enough." The night before the reunion, Evelyn stood at the window of the bedroom she used to share with Thomas, staring into the darkness. The wind rattled the trees and, somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. But inside their home, the silence was crushing. She ran her fingers along the edge of the dresser, touching old framed photographs, birthdays, anniversaries, fleeting smiles from another lifetime. A lump formed in her throat as she lifted one of the frames, their wedding photo, and studied the woman she used to be. Full of hope, full of life. She pressed the frame to her chest for a moment, breathing in the memories before quietly setting it face down. Somewhere along the way, Thomas had stopped seeing her. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped loving her. Yet foolishly, Evelyn kept believing that if she just held on tighter, he might remember who she was. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself, "I'll remind him. Not with anger, not with tears, but just by being the woman he'd forgotten how to love." She reached for the simple gold necklace Thomas had once given her, slipping it around her neck like delicate armor. Downstairs, Thomas was sprawled on the sofa, laughing into his phone, oblivious to the ache pulsing through the house. "Yeah, man, just wait till you see her. She's a shadow of who she used to be," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Megan's going to shine beside her like a damn spotlight." Evelyn heard the muffled laughter and clenched her hands into fists, willing herself not to cry. She could feel her throat tighten, a heavy lump rising that she tried desperately to swallow down. For a fleeting moment, the urge to run, to lock herself in the bathroom and let the tears fall, was almost overwhelming. But she forced herself to stay quiet, to move softly, to refuse Thomas the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she tiptoed back upstairs, each step heavier than the last. In the bathroom, she brushed her hair in silence, smoothing the strands into a soft twist at the nape of her neck. The face in the mirror looked tired, the skin beneath her eyes shadowed from restless nights, but she made herself meet her own gaze, forcing her trembling lips into something like a smile. She didn't see the woman Thomas saw. She saw resilience. She saw survival. Tomorrow wasn't about revenge. It was about walking into a room full of people who'd counted her out and refusing to let their whispers crush her. Her mind spun with worries. Would she stumble? Would her voice shake? Would anyone even care she was there? But beneath the anxiety, a stubborn ember of dignity refused to die. Tomorrow, she would no longer be the forgotten wife. Even if she was invisible to Thomas, she would see herself. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. As she turned out the light, the shadows swallowed her form, but inside her chest, a stubborn ember of dignity still burned. In a quiet part of town, nestled between glass towers and busy cafes, Evelyn climbed the stairs of a modest office building. Her palms were sweaty, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. She adjusted the strap of her purse and hesitated for a moment in front of the polished oak door before finally pushing it open. Matthew looked up from his desk as soon as she entered, his expression softening instantly. "Evelyn," he said warmly, standing to greet her. She smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. Matthew's presence had a way of grounding her, a calm, steady strength that never demanded anything from her. "I needed to see you before tomorrow," Evelyn said, her voice trembling only slightly. Matthew crossed the room in 2 strides and gently took her hands in his. "You don't owe them anything," he said quietly. "You don't have to prove a thing." Evelyn shook her head. "I know, but I have to face it for myself." Matthew studied her, pride flickering in his deep-set eyes. "Then you won't do it alone," he promised. They sat together by the wide window, the city lights stretching into the horizon. Evelyn leaned into Matthew's steady presence, feeling the strength she'd been denied for so long. "Thomas thinks he's walking me into a trap," she said softly. She spoke bitterly, twining her fingers together. Matthew's jaw tightened. "Let him think that," he replied. "It'll make it all the sweeter when he realizes you're far beyond his reach." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You're not coming tomorrow?" she asked, more as a question than a statement. Matthew chuckled softly. "You said you wanted to handle this your way. I'll be there, but only if you want me to be seen." Evelyn's eyes shimmered with emotion. "Stay hidden," she whispered. "Let me show him without saying a word." Matthew lifted her hand to his lips, brushing a gentle kiss across her knuckles. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Evelyn," he murmured. "No matter what happens, remember, you are not defined by their cruelty." Evelyn blinked back tears and nodded silently. For the first time in months, she didn't feel small. She felt seen, cherished, and tomorrow she would carry that unseen strength like a crown. The memory of their wedding was tucked safely in Evelyn's heart, a quiet treasure few knew about. It had been a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the sun kissed the ground, but the wind kept everything honest. She wore a simple white dress, no frills, no crowd, just a soft silk gown that floated around her ankles. Matthew had waited for her under a sprawling oak tree in the garden of a small country inn, dressed not in a tuxedo, but in a dark, tailored suit that made his eyes look even warmer. Evelyn had walked toward him barefoot, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. Her heart had pounded with disbelief that after everything, after Thomas's indifference, after the loneliness that had clawed at her, someone truly wanted her. "I'm not marrying your past, Evelyn," Matthew had said as he placed a ring on her finger. "I'm marrying your future." She had cried then, not out of sadness, but from the overwhelming, frightening, beautiful reality of being chosen, truly chosen. Back in the present, Evelyn sat by the window with a small velvet box in her lap, the wedding band Matthew had given her. She turned it over between her fingers, a bittersweet smile on her lips. It was not flashy or heavy with gems. It was simple, elegant, full of meaning, just like the love they shared. They had agreed to keep their marriage quiet until Evelyn felt ready to fully let go of her old life. She hadn't wanted her new beginning overshadowed by whispers of scandal or pity. Matthew had understood, never pushing or demanding that she hurry her healing. As she looked at the golden band now, Evelyn thought about the reunion and the cruel trap being set for her. They didn't know that the woman walking into that hall wasn't the battered soul they had left behind. They didn't know. She was no longer alone. With a deep breath, Evelyn slipped the ring back into its box and tucked it into her purse. It wasn't time to reveal that part yet. Tomorrow was about standing tall, not for them, but for herself. The next morning, Matthew stood in the kitchen of their private penthouse, brewing coffee just the way Evelyn liked it, a soft blend with a hint of vanilla. His movements were unhurried, deliberate, like a man who had mastered patience in a world always rushing. When Evelyn entered, barefoot and wearing one of his oversized shirts, he simply smiled and handed her a cup without a word. She accepted it with both hands, drawing warmth from more than just the coffee. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, her eyes searching his. Matthew leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching her with a gaze that never wavered. "I know," he replied simply. "But I want to. I want to remind you every moment that you're not walking into that room alone." Evelyn sipped her coffee, letting the rich flavor anchor her fraying nerves. "Even if they laugh?" she asked quietly. Matthew's eyes darkened, but his voice stayed steady. "Especially if they laugh. Their ignorance doesn't diminish your worth, it only exposes theirs." Later, as Evelyn packed her simple jewelry and chosen dress into a small garment bag, Matthew came up behind her, resting his hands lightly on her shoulders. "You have nothing to prove," he said again, his voice a low reassurance against the rising tide of doubt she struggled to contain. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling his certainty seep into her like sunlight. "I know," she whispered, though her heart still trembled. Matthew gently turned her to face him, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. "Let them see a woman they couldn't destroy," he said. "Let them regret ever underestimating you." Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. "You really believe in me that much?" Matthew smiled, a rare, breathtaking smile he saved only for her. "I believe in you more than you believe in yourself, but that's all right. Until you do, I'll believe enough for both of us." Evelyn laughed, the sound half sob, half relief, and buried her face in his chest, in that quiet, unbreakable embrace. She found her answer. She wasn't walking into a battle to fight, she was walking into a room already victorious. They just didn't know it yet. Evelyn stood in front of the full-length mirror, slipping into the dress she had chosen with trembling hands. It wasn't a glamorous gown sparkling with diamonds or sewn with designer labels. It was a soft, dove-gray piece that hugged her figure in all the right places, without ever demanding attention. The neckline was simple, the hemline modest, but the way it floated around her ankles made her feel ethereal, untouchable. She ran her fingers lightly across the fabric, letting its softness remind her that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Matthew leaned against the doorway, watching her silently. "You're beautiful," he said, reverence in every word. Evelyn turned toward him, smoothing down the sides of her dress. "It's plain," she said with a small, almost self-conscious shrug. Matthew shook his head. "No, Evelyn, it's perfect. You don't need glitter to outshine them. You already do." His words settled over her like a protective veil, calming the storm in her chest. Evelyn turned back to the mirror, meeting her own gaze with surprising steadiness. She pinned her hair into a low, loose bun, letting a few soft strands frame her face. She chose a single pair of pearl earrings, a quiet tribute to her mother's grace, and slipped her feet into simple nude heels. No flashy designer purse, no shouting labels, just herself. Refined, understated, and completely unbreakable. Matthew stepped forward, holding a thin silver bracelet between his fingers. "May I?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, lifting her wrist. He clasped it gently around her arm, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "This isn't for them," he said, his voice a tender murmur meant only for her. "It's for you." Evelyn felt tears prick at the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. Tonight wasn't about proving anything, it was about reclaiming the pieces of herself that had been chipped away by years of indifference. She smiled, a real, luminous smile, and whispered, "Thank you, Matthew." In her reflection, she saw not a forgotten wife, not a discarded memory, but a woman who had survived the storm and was still standing tall. Megan lounged in a plush chair at the salon, flipping through magazines while a stylist curled her long hair into soft, cascading waves. She smirked at her reflection, admiring the sharp cut of her red cocktail dress that hung on the nearby rack. "He won't even look at her," she said aloud, tossing the magazine aside. "He's going to realize the second we walk in that he upgraded." The stylist gave a polite, non-committal laugh, clearly used to overhearing vain clients. Megan checked her phone, scrolling through pictures of Thomas in his tailored suit, herself draped on his arm like a trophy. "Poor Evelyn," she said in mock sympathy, pouting at the mirror, showing up looking like some charity case. She imagined the shocked looks on their classmates' faces, the whispers, the stifled laughter. It gave her a heady rush of satisfaction. She was ready to show the world that Thomas had chosen better, smarter, prettier. That evening, in a flurry of expensive perfume and designer heels, Megan posed beside Thomas for a quick photo before they left. "You ready to steal the show, baby?" she teased, slipping her arm through his. Thomas grinned, adjusting his cufflinks. "Evelyn won't know what hit her," he said with a chuckle. In the car, Megan rehearsed her smiles, practiced the tilt of her chin, the way she'd subtly flaunt the bracelet Thomas had bought her. A piece that sparkled far more ostentatiously than the simple jewelry she imagined Evelyn would wear. "When we walk in," Megan instructed smoothly, "make sure you introduce me first. I want everyone to see who the real woman in your life is." Thomas nodded distractedly, texting one of his old college friends. Megan glanced at him and, for a fleeting moment, felt a sliver of unease. the casual way he treated loyalty, the ease with which he discarded people. But she quickly buried the thought beneath layers of confidence and ambition. After tonight, Evelyn would be nothing but a sad shadow fading into the background. Megan smiled to herself, picturing the moment of triumph, the sweet taste of victory on the tip of her tongue. The parking lot of the Grand Hotel buzzed with laughter and anticipation as former classmates hugged and exchanged pleasantries under the glittering chandeliers spilling through the tall glass windows. Thomas adjusted his jacket and extended a hand toward Megan, who stepped out of the car as if arriving for a red carpet event. Her dress shimmered, her makeup was flawless, and she leaned possessively into Thomas's side. They entered the lobby to a flurry of impressed glances. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Wow, Thomas really scored," someone whispered, and Megan's smile widened. Across the room, heads turned, eager to catch sight of the old couple they remembered, but not in the way Megan had imagined. Moments later, Evelyn stepped through the entrance. Her simple gray gown flowed softly around her, her posture serene. She didn't need the flash of sequins or the jangle of jewelry to command attention. A hush fell over the room as Evelyn's quiet elegance cut through the noise like a whisper in a storm. She didn't scan the room looking for approval. She simply walked forward, head held high, as if she owned every inch of ground beneath her feet. But with every step, Evelyn could feel her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the room must hear it. For a split second, her legs felt unsteady, and she had to concentrate on not stumbling. The urge to shrink away, to let her gaze drop to the floor and fade into the wallpaper, was almost overwhelming. She kept her eyes forward, repeating a silent mantra, "You belong here. You belong here." Each breath was measured, shallow, as she braced herself for the smirks, the whispered mockery, the judgmental eyes she had imagined haunting her for weeks. Thomas barely concealed his sneer. "There she is," he muttered to Megan under his breath. Megan squeezed his arm and giggled, but her laughter faltered as she noticed the curious expressions around the room. Instead of snickers or pointed fingers, there was a strange stillness. Eyes followed Evelyn, not with ridicule, but with awe. Evelyn made her way to a quiet corner, her steps unhurried, acknowledging a few old classmates with polite smiles. She knew what was happening. She could feel the subtle shift in the air. They had expected the ghost of a woman, beaten down, desperate. Instead, she gave them grace and dignity as she stood by the refreshment table. A few women approached hesitantly, offering careful compliments. "You look different, Evelyn," one murmured. "Beautiful," another added quietly. Evelyn simply smiled, the corners of her eyes soft. She didn't need to explain where she'd been or what she'd endured. Her presence spoke louder than any words. Even as she accepted their kindness, she could feel the tremor in her hands, the tension in her shoulders, refusing to fully ease. Beneath her calm exterior, Evelyn was fighting the urge to turn and run, to escape the scrutiny she'd feared for so long. But with every kind word, every genuine glance, the icy knot of anxiety in her stomach loosened just a little more. And though Thomas and Megan whispered feverishly to each other, plotting how to turn the tide, Evelyn had already won. A silent victory, one they hadn't even realized was unfolding. It started small, a ripple, barely noticeable at first. A couple near the bar leaned in, whispering behind raised glasses. The group by the stage exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. One by one, old classmates who hadn't seen Evelyn in years found themselves caught off guard by the quiet power she carried. She wasn't the timid, shrinking woman many remembered. There was a strength in her posture, a peace in her smile that couldn't be faked. "I heard she's doing really well now," a woman in a navy dress whispered to her husband. "Better than Thomas, that's for sure." Another group huddled near the punch table, speculating about Evelyn's life. "She doesn't look like someone struggling," a man muttered, furrowing his brow. "Look at that ring on her finger. That's not cheap." His friend nodded thoughtfully. The murmurs traveled like wildfire, spreading doubt, curiosity, and even grudging admiration. Thomas, oblivious to the growing stir, was too busy basking in the early attention he and Megan received. Megan, however, caught the shifting undercurrent. She tugged at Thomas's sleeve, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "They're staring," she hissed under her breath. "Good," Thomas said smugly, smoothing down his jacket. "Let them see what they missed out on." But Megan wasn't so sure anymore. She noticed how the women looked at Evelyn. Not with pity, but with a strange kind of respect. Men, too, glanced at her longer than necessary, their conversations momentarily pausing when she passed by. Even the event organizer, a respected alumnus named Jordan, made a beeline for Evelyn, offering her a warm, deferential greeting. "Evelyn," Jordan said warmly, shaking her hand. "It's been far too long. You look incredible." Evelyn smiled, sincere but reserved. "Thank you, Jordan. It's good to see everyone again." Thomas scowled from a distance, irritation simmering under his skin. Things were not going the way he had imagined. Megan squeezed his arm tighter, her nails digging in, both of them silently realizing that the woman they thought they'd crushed had somehow risen far above their reach. Desperation brewed in Megan's chest as she watched Evelyn move through the room, collecting glances and hushed admiration without even trying. She couldn't allow this narrative to settle. It was supposed to be her night. With a sugary smile pasted on her face, Megan tugged Thomas along toward the small gathering where Evelyn stood. "Oh my gosh, Evelyn," Megan gushed loudly, drawing attention. "You made it!" The falseness in her tone was so thick it practically oozed onto the marble floor. Evelyn turned slowly, her smile polite but cautious. "Hello, Megan," she said softly, giving nothing away. Megan pressed on, undeterred. "It's so good to see you," she said, looping her arm through Thomas's and leaning her head on his shoulder dramatically. "We were just talking about how brave you are for coming tonight. You know, after everything." Her voice dropped into a sickly sweet tone that barely concealed the venom. A few people nearby pretended not to listen, but their ears were tuned in, catching every word. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face serene. She tilted her head slightly, her voice steady as she replied, "Life has a way of teaching you resilience, Megan." Megan blinked, momentarily thrown off by Evelyn's calmness. Thomas, emboldened by Megan's jab, chuckled under his breath. "Well, I guess not." "Everyone gets a fairy tale ending, huh?" Thomas said, loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. A few awkward laughs escaped, but the tension was palpable. Evelyn smiled gently, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. Inside, Evelyn felt the sting of humiliation, a flush creeping up her neck as she registered the eyes watching, waiting for her reaction. For a split second, her hands trembled so slightly she was grateful for the cover of her glass. The familiar urge to shrink, to simply disappear, almost overtook her. But instead, she forced her breathing to slow and lifted her chin, determined not to let her voice crack or her posture betray her. "True," she said, sipping her drink slowly, "but sometimes what looks like an ending is just the beginning of something far more beautiful." Her words lingered in the air, cutting sharper than any insult Megan or Thomas could have crafted. The little cluster around them grew silent, exchanging looks. Megan's fingers dug harder into Thomas's arm, panic flickering across her face. She had swung the first punch, expecting Evelyn to crumble, but instead she had exposed her own desperation for everyone to see. And Evelyn stood taller, steadier, her quiet dignity louder than any cruel word could ever be. From across the banquet hall, hidden among a group of investors and alumni, Matthew stood silently with a glass of champagne in hand. His dark, tailored suit fit his broad shoulders effortlessly, his expression unreadable yet somehow commanding. He kept his distance, respecting Evelyn's wishes, but his eyes never strayed far from her. He watched as she navigated every passive-aggressive comment with poise, never raising her voice, never showing the crack that trembled beneath the surface. Matthew's fingers tightened around the stem of his glass when Thomas threw his head back in another loud, boisterous laugh, showing off like a clown desperate for attention. A man beside Matthew, an old professor, leaned over, unaware of Matthew's connection. "Pity about Evelyn," he said. "Thomas really threw her under the bus years ago. Look at her now, though. She's unbreakable." Matthew nodded slightly, pride swelling quietly inside him. He would remain in the shadows tonight, but he knew if Evelyn stumbled, even a little, he would be there to catch her before she ever hit the ground. Meanwhile, Evelyn felt the heat of the room closing in on her. Though she smiled and nodded politely at conversations, the strain pressed against her ribs like a vice. Her mind raced with doubts. Was she fooling anyone? Could they see the fear and shame she was trying so hard to hide? She pressed her palm discreetly against her side, grounding herself in the physical moment. As her chest tightened, she told herself she would not break. Not tonight. Not here. Her gaze flickered instinctively across the room, and there, partially hidden by the crowd, she caught a glimpse of Matthew. Their eyes locked for a fleeting heartbeat, and it was enough. In that small, secret exchange, she drew breath again. She straightened her spine and let herself exhale slowly, feeling anchored by the silent encouragement pouring from him. No one else noticed, and that was the beauty of it. Matthew wasn't here to parade around or steal the moment. He was here solely for her, a living reminder that she was loved beyond measure, even when surrounded by those who once celebrated her downfall. Evelyn turned back to the group she was speaking with, her voice stronger, her laughter lighter. She didn't need to fight fire with fire. She had something far more devastating: quiet, unstoppable resilience, and an unseen champion who believed in her, even when she had forgotten how to believe in herself. But holding on to that composure took everything she had. Underneath her calm surface, Evelyn's stomach twisted as Thomas's voice cut through the chatter, and for a fleeting moment, she wondered if she should just slip out the side door, let them have their spectacle without her. The urge to disappear rose like a tide, but she forced herself to stand firm, grounding her heels against the polished floor. Feeling the crowd's shifting attention, Thomas decided to escalate his performance, oblivious to the undercurrents he was stirring. "It's funny," he said loudly to a circle of classmates, drawing more listeners with every word. "How life turns out. Some people just peak early, you know?" His grin was wide, insufferable, as he cast a pointed glance toward Evelyn, not bothering to hide it. Megan laughed on cue, looping her arm through his possessively. "Some of us just move on to better things," she added with a sugary tilt of her head. The crowd gave polite chuckles, but there was an awkwardness lacing the air now, as if everyone understood the cruelty beneath their words but didn't dare challenge it openly. Thomas took a long sip of his drink, encouraged by the few scattered laughs, mistaking their discomfort for admiration. He swaggered through the room, exaggerating his importance, dropping names and bragging about a promotion that barely scratched the surface of true success. For him, image was everything, and tonight he thought he had the perfect one. Evelyn watched from a distance, feeling both pity and a pang of old hurt. She hadn't expected Thomas to change, not really, but seeing how desperately he clung to the illusion of success, how much he needed Megan's validation like oxygen, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't anticipated. She realized, with a bittersweet clarity, that the man she once loved had become a stranger, one who mistook noise for substance and attention for love. For a heartbeat, her chest tightened, old doubts and wounds resurfacing. Was she really strong or just pretending? But then she glanced down at her hands, steady now, and took a slow breath. No, she thought. She had survived too much to let insecurity take root again. Ellen, a former classmate she hadn't seen in years, drifted over with a soft smile. "You're handling this with such grace, Evelyn," Ellen whispered. "Honestly, it's inspiring to watch." Evelyn's throat tightened, but she managed a small laugh. "Survival leaves no room for bitterness," she said quietly. Ellen's eyes warmed. If only they understood the difference between real success and cheap spectacle. Across the room, Thomas continued to laugh too loudly, drawing attention to himself with every arrogant word. What he didn't realize was that the more he spoke, the smaller he appeared. Evelyn didn't need to raise her voice or retaliate. Thomas's own actions were painting him into the very corner he thought he had trapped her in. And for once, she didn't feel like a victim standing in his shadow. She felt like someone who had finally stepped out into the light. As the evening wore on, the energy in the room shifted further, from polite tolerance to barely concealed intrigue. Ellen, sipping her wine thoughtfully, decided she had seen enough. She drifted into a nearby conversation, dropping a comment just loud enough to catch people's attention. "It's amazing how far Evelyn's come, considering everything she's been through," she said lightly. A few heads snapped up. "You know," Ellen continued, her tone artfully casual, "some people think they're climbing ladders, but it turns out they've been digging holes instead." The meaning wasn't lost on anyone. Thomas, hearing the ripples of laughter that followed, felt his face tighten. He turned sharply toward Evelyn, only to find her laughing gently at something Jordan was saying, her eyes crinkling at the corners, her body language effortless. She didn't look broken. She didn't even look bruised. She looked free, and it scared him in a way he hadn't expected. Meanwhile, conversations crackled quietly across the room, seeds of doubt blooming like wildfire. "Did you hear?" A woman whispered to her companion. "Evelyn's remarried, heard her husband's some kind of investor." Another chimed in. "I think he's here tonight. No one's seen him yet, though." Thomas caught fragments of these whispers and stiffened, the hair on the back of his neck prickling. Megan clung tighter to his side, sensing the shift but unable to control it. "Ignore them," she hissed. "They're just jealous." But Thomas couldn't ignore it. He saw the way the tide was turning. Not because Evelyn was shouting for attention, but because her very presence made their petty cruelty look cheap. Ellen approached Evelyn again, her smile laced with meaning. "Some people shine brightest when they stop waiting for permission," she said softly. Evelyn smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe some lights are meant to burn quietly," she replied. "The right time comes." And that time, Evelyn could feel it stirring, was almost here. The doors to the banquet hall opened again with a soft creak, and a quiet murmur rippled through the room. Matthew entered with an easy, unhurried stride, his dark tailored suit absorbing the light, his presence commanding but never boastful. He moved among the guests with effortless grace, exchanging polite nods, a faint smile playing on his lips. To most people, he appeared to be just another successful businessman, aloof, mysterious, untouchable. But a few sharp-eyed guests noticed how the air shifted subtly around him, how conversations paused when he passed by. Without announcing himself, Matthew's aura demanded respect. He found a spot near one of the tall windows, deliberately positioning himself where he could observe Evelyn from a distance without drawing suspicion. To anyone else, he was simply another investor. But to Evelyn, when she glanced up and found him there, it was as if the earth had steadied beneath her feet. Thomas noticed the stir, the subtle glances people threw toward the newcomer, and curiosity gnawed at him. "Who's that?" he muttered to Megan, who craned her neck slightly to look. "No idea," she said with a tight smile. "Probably another boring suit trying to show off." But Matthew didn't parade himself. He didn't flash wealth or seek attention. Instead, it was his restraint, his composed silence, that drew eyes toward him like gravity. As people whispered guesses about his identity, Evelyn moved easily through the crowd, exchanging quiet greetings, her confidence no longer just a shield but a natural part of her presence. She caught Matthew's eye briefly, and the faintest tilt of his head told her everything she needed to know. "I'm here. I've got you." Evelyn smiled softly to herself, her heart calming. Despite the mounting tension in the room, tonight wasn't about showing off power. It was about owning the quiet, relentless strength that had carried her through the darkest storms. And Matthew was the silent pillar standing firm behind her. As Evelyn mingled quietly, Ellen wasn't the only one rallying silently to her side. Former classmates, who had once been bystanders or even skeptics, found themselves unable to resist the urge to gravitate toward her. One by one, they approached, under the pretense of casual conversation, but their words carried more weight. "You've changed, Evelyn," said James, an old classmate who had barely spared her a glance back in college. "It's admirable." Another, Melissa, leaned in with a wink. "I always thought you deserved better than what you got." Their voices were hushed, but the sincerity was unmistakable. Evelyn listened politely, offering soft thank yous, her heart swelling with a complicated mixture of emotions: validation, sadness, and quiet triumph. These weren't just compliments, they were acknowledgments of battles fought in silence, of victories they could only now begin to understand. Thomas and Megan, standing off to the side, watched the shifting energy with increasing alarm. "What is happening?" Megan hissed under her breath, her fingers clenching the stem of her wineglass. Thomas shook his head, his mouth a thin, furious line. "They're just being polite," he said stiffly, but even he didn't believe it. He saw the way people lingered around Evelyn, the respect clear in their body language. Worse, he noticed that no one clung to his words anymore. No one laughed at his jokes quite as heartily. Megan, desperate to recapture the spotlight, sidled up to a nearby group and tried to inject herself into their conversation. "Thomas and I just got back from a trip to Paris," she said loudly, flashing her bracelet, but the reaction was muted and distracted as the group's attention inevitably wandered back toward Evelyn, who stood in the center of it all. Evelyn didn't gloat, didn't preen, she simply stood serene and luminous, while the tide shifted irrevocably in her favor. Without raising her voice, without seeking vengeance, she was being elevated not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. Megan's smile strained at the corners as she watched Evelyn command silent admiration without a single flashy accessory or desperate boast. Panic gnawed at her carefully constructed image, and she tightened her grip on Thomas's arm. "Do something," she whispered harshly, her eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Thomas shrugged her off irritably, muttering, "You're the one who wanted the show, remember?" But Megan knew if she didn't act fast, she would fade into the background like a wilted flower next to Evelyn's effortless bloom. Driven by a mixture of fear and fury, she stepped deliberately toward Matthew, who stood near the windows, quietly sipping his drink. She offered her brightest, most dazzling smile. "Hi there," she purred, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I don't think we've met. Megan, Thomas's fiancée." Her voice dripped with sweetness, but her eyes were sharp, searching for a crack in Matthew's armor she could exploit. Matthew looked at her hand, then at her, his expression unreadable. Slowly, almost politely, he shook her hand, and then immediately let go. "Matthew," he said, his voice cool, offering nothing more. Megan tilted her head, sensing the usual charm offensive wasn't working. She laughed lightly, trying again. "You must be new around here. Stick with us. We're the life of the party," she said, fluttering her lashes shamelessly. Matthew merely smiled thinly, his gaze already drifting past her, back to where Evelyn stood, radiant, even in her stillness. Realizing she was being dismissed without even a word, Megan's cheeks flushed red with anger. She turned back to Thomas, her steps stiff, her mouth set in a hard line. "Who is that guy?" Megan hissed. Thomas frowned, finally truly noticing Matthew's effortless presence. "No idea," he muttered, but a sick feeling twisted in his gut. Megan's desperation had backfired, and instead of dimming Evelyn's light, all she had done was reveal just how small and desperate she herself had become, and the night wasn't even close to over. Yet the soft clinking of glasses drew everyone's attention as Thomas swaggered to the center of the hall, a half-filled wine glass raised high. His voice, slightly slurred from too much champagne, rang out with forced cheerfulness. "Everyone," he called, flashing a wide grin. "Can I get your attention for just a minute?" Conversations died down reluctantly, a hush falling over the room. Evelyn froze where she stood, her fingers curling lightly around her glass, already sensing the cruelty lining Thomas's words before he even spoke them. Megan beamed proudly by his side, clearly believing the moment would finally cement their triumph. Thomas cleared his throat dramatically, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Let's raise a glass," he said loudly, pausing to sweep the room with his gaze. "To resilience, to bouncing back after life's little setbacks." His eyes locked onto Evelyn, the message unmistakable. Some guests chuckled uncomfortably, others shifted awkwardly, sensing the ugliness beneath his joke, but unsure how to react. Before the silence could thicken into humiliation, a second glass lifted into the air, steady, deliberate, commanding attention without a single word. Matthew stepped forward from the side of the room, his presence instantly drawing eyes like a magnet. "I'll drink to that," he said calmly, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. But unlike Thomas's mockery, there was nothing cruel in Matthew's tone. He turned to face Evelyn fully, lifting his glass a little higher. "To those who rise stronger, who wear their scars like armor, and whose worth isn't measured by those too small to recognize it." The room seemed to hold its breath for a beat. No one moved. Then slowly, murmurs of agreement and scattered applause broke out. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as her eyes met Matthew's across the crowd. Steady, sure, unshakable. Thomas stood frozen, his smirk faltering, confusion clouding his features. Megan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. In a single effortless move, Matthew had taken Thomas's weapon and turned it into a shield for Evelyn, and the room, once leaning toward mockery, now leaned toward awe. Thomas's hand lowered slowly, his smirk collapsing into a tight, sour grimace. The applause continued for a few moments longer, scattered but sincere, and Evelyn could feel the tide of the evening fully, finally turning in her favor. Matthew didn't rush. He walked toward her with easy, confident strides, each step dismissing Thomas's attempted cruelty without needing a single harsh word. Matthew stopped a respectful distance from Evelyn, holding out his hand. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said smoothly, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear. "May I have this dance?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Recognition sparked in a few faces, followed by a flurry of whispers. Matthew Whitmore, the discreet billionaire investor. Thomas's head snapped toward Evelyn, his face pale and disbelieving. Megan blinked, furiously trying to process what she had just heard. Evelyn hesitated only for a fraction of a second before slipping her hand into Matthew's. Her fingers steady, her back straight, as Matthew led her gently to the center of the room. Evelyn felt 1,000 invisible shackles fall away from her body. The music shifted seamlessly into a soft, elegant melody, and without needing to rehearse, they moved together in perfect harmony. Matthew leaned down slightly, murmuring, "You're doing beautifully." Evelyn smiled up at him, blinking back tears. "I was terrified," she whispered. "You never showed it," he replied with a soft chuckle. Around them, the guests watched, mesmerized, a silent, undeniable acknowledgement forming among them. This was no forgotten woman, no discarded wife clinging to memories. This was someone entirely reborn, standing in the arms of a man who saw her, who chose her, not because she was convenient, but because she was irreplaceable. Thomas remained rooted to his spot, the wineglass trembling in his hand, the full magnitude of what he had lost settling heavily in his gut. No laughter now, no mockery. Only the sound of music weaving around the new queen of the room and the silence of a man realizing too late the treasure he had thrown away. Megan stood rigid beside Thomas, her nails digging crescent moons into her clutch as she stared at the scene unfolding before her. Every fiber of her being screamed to intervene, to claw back the attention, to remind everyone that she, not Evelyn, was supposed to be the star tonight. But as the whispers grew louder, as admiring glances traced the outline of Evelyn and Matthew dancing effortlessly, Megan felt something cold and slippery coil around her. "Dear." Desperation clutched at her throat. She stepped forward hastily, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, forcing a brittle laugh. "Well," she said loudly, her voice too high-pitched, too eager, "I guess Evelyn's finally found someone to clean up after her mistakes." A few heads turned, but instead of laughter, Megan was met with tight-lipped stares and awkward silence. Someone coughed quietly, someone else shook their head. Megan's words hung in the air, ugly and shrill against the elegance of the moment. Matthew barely spared Megan a glance, his attention wholly devoted to Evelyn, but others were not so kind. Ellen, standing nearby, lifted a single arched brow and said coolly, "Funny. It seems like she's the one everyone wishes they were tonight." Megan's mouth fell open in shock, but Ellen was already turning away, dismissing her with elegant finality. The color drained from Megan's face as she realized the truth clawing at her. She hadn't won. No matter how flashy her dress, no matter how many boasts she tossed into conversations, she had been invisible tonight, overshadowed by the very woman she had tried to destroy. In a desperate last attempt, Megan clutched Thomas's arm, hissing under her breath, "Say something. Fix this." But Thomas shook her off roughly, his jaw tight, his pride bleeding out of him in slow, humiliating drips. Megan stumbled back a step, feeling the room's indifference to her plight like a slap. She had fought so hard to be seen, only to discover that in Evelyn's silent, luminous victory, she had rendered herself completely, irrevocably forgotten. Thomas stood paralyzed in the middle of the ballroom, as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. Around him, conversations resumed, but this time, he wasn't at the center of them. No one glanced his way with admiration. No one sought his approval. The only whispers he caught carried pity or disdain, words like fool and blind slipping through the air like poison darts. Megan hovered near him, her face a mask of strained smiles, but Thomas barely registered her presence. His eyes were glued to Evelyn, whose laughter now floated easily, who danced effortlessly with a man who radiated everything Thomas had only ever pretended to be. He could feel it happening, feel the weight of realization crushing his chest. He hadn't just lost a marriage. He had lost a woman who, without needing revenge or theatrics, had eclipsed him entirely. He swallowed thickly, his throat burning. The people he thought would cheer his new life now barely offered him a second glance. "You okay, man?" someone, an old college friend, muttered as they passed, but there was no sincerity in the words, only awkwardness. Thomas nodded stiffly, unable to form a coherent reply, his hands still clenching his empty glass as it trembled slightly. Megan hissed beside him, "Don't just stand there looking pathetic." But for the first time, Thomas had no snide remark, no arrogance to shield himself with. He saw himself clearly now, desperate, hollow, a man who had traded gold for glitter and was only realizing it when it was far too late. Across the room, Evelyn caught his gaze for a fleeting second. She didn't sneer. She didn't smirk. She simply offered a serene, almost compassionate smile. The smile of someone who had long since made peace with the past and moved on. That smile shattered Thomas more than any shouted accusation ever could. He turned away, his heart hammering painfully against his ribs, every ounce of his so-called triumph crumbling into dust beneath his feet. The music shifted to a softer melody as Matthew gently spun Evelyn in his arms before leading her to the edge of the dance floor. She knew it was time to leave, not out of defeat, but out of dignity. Her moment had passed, and she had claimed it quietly, without needing to drag anyone through the mud. As Matthew helped her slip on her light shawl, a few former classmates approached with warm smiles, offering words Evelyn had once longed to hear, but no longer needed for validation. "You look radiant," someone said. "You're glowing," said another. Evelyn smiled, gracefully thanking each of them without lingering. She didn't need their approval anymore. Her strength no longer hinged on whether others saw it. Matthew offered his arm, and she looped hers through it, standing taller than she ever had. Together, they made their way toward the exit, their pace unhurried, their presence impossible to ignore. As they reached the double doors, Evelyn paused, glancing back one final time. Thomas stood slumped near the bar, shoulders hunched, his confidence bleeding away with every second that passed. Megan clung desperately to his side, her fake laughter louder than necessary, but no one seemed to be listening. Evelyn watched them for a moment, the couple who had once sought to crush her, and felt nothing but a profound, cleansing sense of release. She squeezed Matthew's hand gently. "Ready to go?" she asked softly. He leaned in, pressing a tender kiss to her temple. "Whenever you are, my love," he murmured. Without another backward glance, Evelyn stepped through the doors into the crisp night air, leaving behind the broken remnants of a life that no longer fit her. She hadn't needed revenge. She hadn't needed a dramatic scene. All she needed was to walk away, radiant, unbowed, and finally free. The valet brought Matthew's sleek black car to the front of the hotel, and Evelyn slid into the passenger seat, her heart still thundering with 1,000 emotions. As they drove away, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and silver, but all she could focus on was the soothing warmth of Matthew's hand wrapped around hers. They rode in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Matthew spoke, his voice low and sure. "You were magnificent tonight," he said. Evelyn turned her head to look at him, and the affection in his eyes nearly undid her. "I was terrified," she admitted with a shaky laugh. Matthew squeezed her hand. "You didn't show it," he said, smiling gently. "You didn't just survive them, Evelyn, you rose so far above them, they can't even touch you anymore." Tears pricked at her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of gratitude, for herself, for the journey, and for the man who stood by her side without ever trying to dim her light. As the city lights flickered past outside the window, Evelyn let her head fall back against the seat. Only now, with the pressure of the night behind her, did she notice how her entire body ached with exhaustion. Her fingers were still trembling faintly, a leftover current of anxiety running beneath her gratitude and relief. She had done it, but the cost lingered, a heaviness in her chest, a tension she couldn't fully release. For a second, a familiar voice of doubt whispered, "What if next time you're not strong enough? What if this is as far as you can go?" Evelyn closed her eyes and let the wave pass, reminding herself that survival sometimes meant accepting those doubts and carrying them anyway. When they arrived home, Matthew parked the car and turned fully toward her. For a moment, they just sat there, the soft hum of the engine the only sound between them. Then Matthew reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the best way. "No one defines you but you, Evelyn," he said, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "Not the past, not their cruelty, only you." Evelyn leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as the last shards of old pain melted away. "Thank you," she whispered. Matthew leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers. "You don't have to thank me," he murmured. "Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." Later, as she prepared for bed, Evelyn paused in front of the bathroom mirror. For a fleeting moment, she saw the tired woman who'd once been afraid to face the world. Shadows lingered beneath her eyes, a memory of sleepless nights and battles fought in silence. She let her palm rest against the cool glass and quietly promised herself to be patient, to accept that healing was never a straight path. Wrapped in the safety of his embrace, Evelyn allowed herself a rare, unguarded moment of peace. She had faced the storm, and she had emerged stronger, loved, and finally, completely whole. Meanwhile, Thomas stumbled back into his apartment, well after midnight, the heavy door slamming behind him with a dull thud that echoed in the empty space. He dropped his keys onto the counter and stared blankly around the cold, minimalist decor, suddenly feeling more like a prison than a home. Megan had left earlier, furious and embarrassed, muttering about needing space, but Thomas barely heard her. His mind was stuck replaying the night in excruciating detail. Evelyn's grace, Matthew's effortless confidence, the whispers that followed him like a death sentence. For the first time in years, he was truly alone, and the silence pressed against him from all sides. He poured himself a drink, the glass clinking against the bottleneck as his hand trembled. As he sat on the edge of the couch, he realized with sickening clarity that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost every ounce of respect. He once commanded the very people who had envied him. Now, they pitied him. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Hope it was worth it. No signature, but Thomas didn't need one. He knew it was from one of his former friends, disgusted by his behavior. Slamming the phone face down on the coffee table, Thomas buried his face in his hands. His world was crumbling. Lawsuits he thought he could suppress were surfacing. Business deals were slipping through his fingers. Colleagues who once greeted him with admiration now offered only tight, polite nods and whispered behind his back. Megan had only ever been part of the illusion he crafted, an illusion that cracked the moment Evelyn walked away, radiant and untouchable. He thought he had upgraded, traded old comfort for new excitement. But excitement faded, and comfort, real comfort, never came. What he was left with was the hollow ache of regret, an empty apartment, and a life that tasted of ash. He hadn't just lost Evelyn, he had lost himself, and he didn't know how to find his way back. Meanwhile, Megan's carefully curated image began unraveling faster than she could contain it. After the reunion, word spread like wildfire through their social circles. Whispers of her calculated cruelty, her obsession with overshadowing Evelyn, her desperate clinging to Thomas's crumbling reputation. All of it bled into the open. Invitations to parties dwindled. Collaborations she'd once boasted about evaporated overnight. She stood in the center of a boutique days later, arguing heatedly with a sales associate about a returned dress, when she noticed two women by the window staring at her. Not with envy, but with thinly veiled amusement. Megan flushed scarlet, tossing her platinum hair over her shoulder as she stormed out. In the past, her tantrums had been forgiven, excused under the label of passion. Now, they were simply embarrassing spectacles, proof that without Thomas's fading clout, she was nothing more than noise. One evening, she dared to show up at a social mixer she hadn't been uninvited from, only to find herself ignored. Conversations shifted away when she approached, smiles tightened, shoulders turned subtly but unmistakably. Even worse, she overheard someone whisper, desperate, clinging to scraps. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she retreated into a corner, nursing a drink she could barely swallow. She had spent so long trying to outshine Evelyn, trying to paint herself as the winner, the better choice, the queen. But queens didn't scramble for attention. They didn't measure their worth by the wreckage they caused. Megan realized too late that the crown she fought for was worthless. because it had been built on pettiness and spite. Now, stripped of the false glamour, she stood exposed, a hollow, bitter woman whose beauty couldn't hide the ugliness festering beneath. No amount of makeup, designer labels, or whispered lies could mask the truth anymore. She had lost, and worse, no one cared enough to remember she had ever played the game. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Matthew and Evelyn's shared home, casting warm, golden pools onto the hardwood floors. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open before her, reviewing final touches on the business project she had quietly been building behind the scenes. Matthew leaned against the counter, watching her with quiet pride. "You're incredible, you know that?" he said, crossing the room to kiss the top of her head. Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling, not with pride, but with quiet contentment. "I just needed time," she said. "Time to find myself again, without the noise." Matthew pulled up a chair beside her. "You didn't find yourself," he corrected gently. "You were always there. You just stopped hiding." Evelyn closed her laptop and reached for his hand. In the quiet spaces they shared, she realized she had blossomed into someone even she hadn't known she could become. Yet sometimes, in the stillness between tasks or the hush before sleep, Evelyn would catch herself questioning if she deserved this new peace. There were moments, brief but sharp, when doubts from the past crept back in, the voice that told her she was too broken to lead, too scarred to be admired, too weary to build something new. Each time she would pause, close her eyes, and recall not just the pain, but how she'd survived it. It was that survival, not perfection, that she carried into her work and her home. Later that afternoon, Evelyn walked into her new office, a sleek but modest space downtown, where her small but passionate team awaited her. They greeted her warmly, eyes bright with excitement for the official launch of her consultancy firm. She had taken everything she learned from surviving emotional wars, from navigating betrayal, and woven it into a career built on lifting others up. "No one fights alone," Evelyn told her team as they gathered for a quick meeting. "We build differently here, with empathy, with strength." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Evelyn stood at the window afterward, looking out at the city bustling below. She wasn't chasing validation anymore. She wasn't proving anything to anyone. She was simply living, fully, fearlessly, on her own terms. The old life had crumbled behind her, and in its place she had built something luminous and lasting, shaped not by bitterness, but by the unshakable truth of who she had always been. Yet beneath her calm, there lingered a gentle ache, a kind of vulnerability she'd learned to accept. She knew that even in happiness, traces of sorrow could remain, shaping her strength in ways no one else could see. And for the first time, she felt grateful for it, not ashamed. That evening, the breeze was cool as Evelyn and Matthew walked hand in hand along the private garden behind their home, the faint scent of jasmine perfuming the air. Lanterns hung low from the trees, casting soft golden circles onto the stone path. Evelyn tilted her head up to look at the stars, a serene smile curving her lips. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Matthew squeezed her hand gently, his heart pounding with anticipation. They stopped at the center of the garden where a small table had been set with 2 glasses of champagne. Evelyn arched a brow in amusement. "Planning something, Mr. Whitmore?" she teased lightly. Matthew chuckled, his eyes gleaming under the warm light. "Always," he murmured. Then, slowly, he knelt before her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Marry me again," Matthew said softly, his voice steady and full of devotion. "This time, not in hiding, not in fear of the past, but because you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, and I want the whole world to know you are mine." Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth, tears pooling in her eyes. She could barely breathe, barely think, overwhelmed by the raw tenderness of the moment. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice breaking. He opened the box, revealing a simple but stunning ring, a solitaire diamond set in a delicate band, elegant and timeless. "Say yes," he said, his voice low. "Say yes to a life where you never have to fight to be loved again." Evelyn dropped to her knees in front of him, laughing through her tears as she threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she breathed. 1,000 times yes. Matthew held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, and in that quiet garden under the stars, without fanfare or witnesses, they promised each other a life built on respect, healing, and an unbreakable love that asked for nothing but their truest selves. Weeks later, Evelyn found herself standing at another gathering. But this time it was different. It wasn't a reunion of old classmates or a confrontation of old wounds. It was a small, intimate party Matthew had thrown for friends and family to celebrate their new chapter. Soft jazz played in the background, laughter floated through the air, and the scent of fresh roses filled the bright sunroom, where guests mingled warmly. Evelyn wore a soft cream dress that flowed around her like a whisper, her natural beauty shining without effort. Matthew, never far from her side, introduced her proudly to everyone, not as someone who needed defending, not as someone who had to earn their place, but simply as his beloved wife. "She's the heart of everything good in my life," Matthew said in a quiet conversation with an old friend, unaware that Evelyn overheard. Her heart swelled so much she thought it might burst. Later, as the crowd thinned and evening deepened into a warm, velvety night, Evelyn and Matthew stepped out onto their balcony overlooking the sparkling city. Evelyn leaned against the railing, the cool air brushing against her skin, feeling more alive than she ever had before. "If someone had told me a year ago I'd be standing here, I wouldn't have believed them," she said, her voice soft and full of wonder. Matthew wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You were always meant for more, Evelyn," he said. "You just needed to walk away from people too small to see it." She smiled, resting her hands on top of his. "Thank you for loving me when I forgot how to love myself." Matthew kissed the side of her neck tenderly. "You saved yourself," he whispered. "I just held the light until you could see it again." So the story's over, and my wonderful friends, are you still here with me? If you're still watching or listening until now, then I know this story has touched something real in your heart, just like it did mine. And maybe, just maybe, you needed to hear this today. Because let's be honest, life doesn't always play fair, does it? Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who break us. Sometimes love turns to silence, and sometimes we find ourselves standing alone in the wreckage of dreams we thought would last forever. But what if, instead of letting that pain harden us, we let it remake us? What if we chose dignity, not revenge? What if we learned that sometimes the strongest thing we can do is walk away, not to run from pain, but to step toward a new kind of freedom? Evelyn's journey isn't just about surviving betrayal. It's about discovering the quiet power of self-respect. It's about learning that your worth isn't measured by who loves you or who walks away. It's measured by the way you get back up, the way you hold your head high, even when no one's clapping for you. There's a quote from Heterodoxism that says, "Healing doesn't ask you to forget the wound, only to honor the lesson." And isn't that what Evelyn showed us? That we don't need revenge. We don't need everyone to see our pain for it to matter. Sometimes the greatest redemption is building a life so peaceful, so full of genuine love, that the people who once tried to break you become nothing but a distant chapter in your story. So if you're here, if you've felt that ache, if you've wondered if you'll ever feel whole again, trust me, you will. Like Evelyn, you are enough. You don't have to fight to be loved. You just have to believe that your healing is worth more than anyone's approval. If this story meant something to you, I'd be so grateful if you'd like, share, or subscribe. Maybe send it to someone who's still searching for their own healing. Remember, you're not alone, and your next chapter can be so much more beautiful than your last. Stay strong, stay gentle, and never forget, your story isn't over yet.